Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Oliver Fiada, and I'm a senior research advisor at Save the Children and one of the organizers of this session today. I wanted to use this opportunity really quickly to welcome you all and to provide you with a really short overview of what you can expect in the next hour. We've heard already a lot at this forum about the Sustainable Development Goals and the pledge to leave no one behind, and obviously the role data can play to get us there and to direct public policy. But public policy often involves public financing decisions about spending on social services, on transfers, on tax regimes. And those can play an essential role to reduce poverty and inequality and to accelerate progress for poor and marginalized communities. But to do so, we need to be able to measure that impact. And we need to measure the impact of those financing decisions on those poor and marginalized communities. And that is what we sometimes call fiscal equity and what we want to focus on in this session today. So over the next hour, we want to take you a bit ambitiously through the different stages of the data production cycle, which is hopefully also holds some learnings relevant beyond the fiscal equity focus. So we want to hear a bit more about where the data gaps are and why this is relevant. We want to learn about existing measurement approaches and their opportunities and challenges, discuss a little bit why it is important that this data is reported, for instance, through the SDG indicator framework. And finally, we want to hear how we can use this data to act and to inform more pro-poor and inclusive decisions. We have a fantastic panel to do that and to take us through this agenda. We have Mark Herod here, Associate Director for Data and Analytics at UNICEF, and the only person we have, unfortunately, in Bern in person. We have Nora Lustig, Professor for Latin American Economics at Tulane University and Director of the Commitment to Equity Institute. We have Carolina Sanchez-Paramo, Global Director of Poverty and Equity at the World Bank. And finally, we have Kevin Watkins, currently visiting professor at development practice at the London School of Economics, until very recently my boss and our CEO of Save the Children UK. So if you have any questions or thoughts, please put them in the Q&A functions on the conference platform, either during the meeting when you want to for the discussions afterwards, but also use that functions after the meeting has finished. We will keep answering questions there. Enrique Della Monica will be our moderator for the session, so he will take over in a second. But before I hand over, we will kick off with a very short video, which sets the scene of why this is important and which introduces two new SDG indicators, which will help us to measure fiscal equity and hopefully move us towards a more equitable progress on the SDGs.
The Sustainable Development Goals embody our highest aspirations for a better world. They provide governments, civil society, and the private sector with policy direction in critical areas for the well-being of people and planet. They include commitments to end poverty in all its forms and to reduce inequality within and among countries. Fighting poverty and inequality requires a systematic analysis of fiscal policies, especially around two questions. Is government spending on social sectors such as health, education, and social protection really benefiting populations living in poverty? And what are the impacts of taxes and transfers on income inequality? Two new indicators in the SDG indicator framework, which tracks and reports progress on the SDGs, help to measure and monitor the impact of fiscal policies. To deliver on its ambition to end poverty in all its forms, SDG 1 explicitly calls for sound policy frameworks which are based on pro-poor development strategies. This is now possible thanks to Indicator 1B1, Pro-Poor Public Social Spending, that came from a proposal from UNICEF and Save the Children. It measures the proportion of government expenditure in education, health, and direct transfers which directly benefit people who face monetary poverty. Data covering more than half of the world's population is now reported and helps us to better understand how governments' financing decisions are really aligned with poverty-reducing strategies. To deliver on the promise of SDG 10 to reduce inequality, we need to monitor the impact of tax and transfers on income distribution. This is now possible thanks to the introduction of Indicator 10.4.2, proposed by the World Bank, Oxfam, and the Commitment to Equity Institute. This indicator reports on the redistributive impact of fiscal policy, which is the difference between pre-fiscal and post-fiscal income inequality. The inclusion of this indicator is an important step toward the creation of a global standard for assessing government effectiveness in truly tackling inequality. Tax, transfers, and spending on social sectors are some of the most powerful instruments in the hands of government to tackle poverty and inequality. Monitoring pro-poor public social spending and the redistributive impact of fiscal policy will support governments and civil servants to act by giving them the chance to make more informed fiscal policy decisions. It also helps citizens and civil society to hold governments to account to ensure that financing decisions are fit to reduce poverty and inequality.
Excellent. So let's start with the first question because we don't have a lot of time. The question is, how can we protect poor and marginalized communities from the multiple risks of COVID-19, conflict, and climate change? And what role can public finance play in safeguarding progress when we try to reduce inequality and poverty? And if you will allow me, I will start with Carolina trying to answer this question and followed by Kevin.
Thank you, Enrique, and thank you to the organizers. It's a real pleasure to be here. I don't think we can understate the impact that COVID-19 has had on poverty and inequality around the world. So I just want to say a couple things on that to really put the conversation around this question in context. In 2021, we are projecting that 100 million people would have fallen into poverty because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated crisis. And even though the data is more tenuous, emerging evidence also points to the fact that the crisis has likely increased both inequality within countries and inequality across countries. And the main reasons, I think, why we see these developments on poverty and inequality is that the crisis has really affected everybody, but has particularly affected the poor and the vulnerable. It's had negative impacts on their employment and income, on their capacity to access public services, health and education, and the associated human capital losses that will result from that. And it's really had a negative impact on the productive capacity overall, because in many cases they have been forced to sell productive assets or to eat up their working capital, leaving them in a much weaker position, when it comes to the recovery. We also know that before the crisis, the poor and the vulnerable had much higher levels of exposure to fragility and conflict and to climate risks. So when you combine all of these, you really see how these populations are at the center of a variety of shocks and risks. So how can we use fiscal policy then to support these groups, both in the immediate term, but also over the long term to build their resilience? Fiscal policy, I think, has already been used effectively, and I think it's important to recognize this during the crisis. Particularly, we see a large number of countries that have expanded access to safety nets and other forms of income support, in many cases targeted to the poor and the vulnerable to compensate for the losses that I was talking about before. And we've also seen investments with more of a mixed effect on trying to move the service, the provision of service, like education and health, to the digital environment, so that we could have some continuity in learning and some continuity in service provision, although there, the extent to which the poor and vulnerable have been reached is a little bit more mixed. In the short term, I think we need to continue these efforts. Not everybody is going to be able to go back to work immediately, even as economies start to recover. So income support will continue to be important, and investments in human capital. And these investments need to focus on remedial interventions to close some of the gaps that the crisis has generated, both in learning and in health, but also access and quality more broadly, over the medium term, and increasing the resilience of these systems. In the long term, investments in infrastructure will continue to be critical. We know that many of these populations are excluded from markets because of distance, because of lack of access to energy. They don't have access to clean water. So all of these continue to be priorities when it comes to fighting poverty and promoting inequality, and now become also vehicles to promote a transition to green growth, because a lot of these investments, including those that target the poor and vulnerable, can be done in different ways that are more resilient and more climate friendly. And then finally, of course, all of this will require resources. So it's important that governments think about how those resources will be mobilized, particularly in a context like the current context where fiscal policy is already stretched in many countries because of the emergency spending that has taken place during the crisis. And there's a pressure to consolidate. And all of that needs to be done with an equity lens in mind, to make sure that when we mobilize resources, when we sort out what's happening with fiscal policy, we don't undermine the support that we are providing to some of these households. And I hope we'll be able to touch on these points as we continue the conversation.
Thank you. Yes, very important points. Kevin?
Thanks, Enrique. And maybe just to build on Carolina's point, monetary poverty is one of the areas where we've seen a really dramatic deterioration, 100 million more people in monetary poverty than would have been the case. But in these other areas like health and education, where to me, the evidence hasn't fully come through in the way that it needs to. So if you take an indicator like child mortality, and admittedly, a lot of the data that we currently have available is from modelling work and not from clinical observation. But the modelling work is all pointing in one direction, and that is a very significant increases in infant mortality in the range of 3 to 7%, depending on the particular study, which is a consequence of the disruption of health systems and in many cases the diversion of resources away from rural clinics into secondary hospitals for the treatment of COVID. Now, that is a catastrophic reversal in the progress that the world had been making on child mortality and child health. Similar indications in nutrition, by the way. Carolina's already mentioned education. We've had over 1.5 billion children who have seen their education disrupted. We know that the average period of disruption is much greater in lower income and lower middle income countries than in high income countries. And as we have millions of children now going back to school, the imperative to put in place remedial support, not just cash transfer support for nutrition, because many of these children will come back into school carrying the handicap of increased poverty, but remedial support in terms of their learning outcomes, making sure they're being taught at the right level. Now, why is this so urgent right now? I think for two reasons. First of all, even before the crisis, we were off track significantly in most of these areas. We are now much further off track than we were. And I think secondly, we're entering an environment now where the fiscal constraints operating on governments that have been pushed furthest off track are far greater. And, we're talking principally here about low income, low middle income and middle income, some middle income countries. We're seeing the impact of debt starting to bite, and it'll bite a lot more if the debt suspension initiative isn't extended. And I think for all of these reasons, the premium on equity to protect the poorest has risen very significantly. And it's why it's so important, I think, that we now have these indicators which provide a practical expression of what people like Nora have been trying to do for many, many years, to take this principle of leave no one behind, which is a great principle, right? Like, who's in favor of leaving people behind? Put your hand up. But we've really lacked concrete tools, both to inform governments and to hold governments accountable. And I think we now have those tools, and it's really vital that we use them.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. The next question that we have is if you could describe a bit more on the current data landscape and what are the gaps? In particular, what do we need in terms of better data to think of policies and financing decisions to address inequality and poverty? If you allow me, I will start with Nora and then continue with Mark. You're muted, Nora. Sorry.
The famous mute button.
There it is. Okay. No, I didn't say anything relevant except thank you for inviting me to be in this panel. It's a great pleasure. And I think, let me start from the three elements that were emphasized a moment ago by both Carolina and Kevin, because they're related to what is that we need in terms of data. One of the things that was mentioned is the importance to continue supporting the cash transfers that have been expanded during the period that the pandemic hit, and have a system that actually would address systemic shocks in a way that it's not always left for improvising as it happened now. Even though a lot of countries were able to expand them, it was really hard to make it happen in other countries precisely because we don't have a system designed to deal with systemic shocks, and systemic shocks will be recurrent as we've seen it, both on the economic front and natural disasters, and now we have pandemics. So for that purpose, one thing that I wanted to mention, and I've mentioned many times, is that we don't have really any of the international organizations tasked with collecting information that's systematic and accurate on the social protection systems that address the area that is not part of the formal sector. So essentially, we have series on cash transfers, but if you look at them, they tend to be quite inconsistent over time for countries, and a lot of countries have not been providing that information. So I want to take this opportunity to ask the UN system to task one of the international organizations to be responsible for the collection of that information in a systematic basis, because that will help countries to make sure that they have that information, and we will be able to compare across countries and over time. It's surprising that it doesn't exist, but as we know, for some reason that fell between the cracks. So that's one point in terms of data, where data needs to be emphasized, and it's going to be very important in order to assess to what extent what we're doing is helping the poor. The second one is, a moment ago, I think Carolina mentioned the importance that as we face the reining in of fiscal deficits, because one of the things that fiscal policy did during the first year of the pandemic is expand spending quite a bit, and all the organizations, including the IMF, was supportive of expanding fiscal deficits, but that will have to be reined in. As we start reining them in, we have to be very careful not to hurt the poor in the process by raising taxes primarily on goods and services that are consumed by the poor, and how that would affect actually their net social protection. I like to talk about net social protection because you spend, but then you have to finance that. If you finance it with taxes that affect the poor, then the poor get a net social protection that sometimes may be nil or even negative, as we found in some countries. So as this happens, more and more will be crucial to be transparent about the information on what's happening to top incomes. Now we've seen the release of information through this Pandora reporting that has been coming out in the last couple of days. This is good to have, but we should have a system in which we can know what's happening with incomes and wealth at the top, and also how much people that are at the top of the income distribution pay in taxes, because that will allow us to identify to what extent the reining in of the fiscal deficits can be done in a fair way by increasing more the taxes that have to be paid by people that are the richer part of society. So far, we have some countries that are systematically publishing the information on top incomes and how much people pay at the top in terms of taxes, but it's only a limited number of countries that do this in a systematic way. And it can be done in a way in which you protect anonymity, so that that should not be a problem. It just needs to be there, the political will and the interest to have this information out there so that we can make the right decisions in terms of how we're going to rein in the fiscal deficits and finance whatever needs to be funded in the future in terms of awarding social protection to the poor and the vulnerable, and also spending on education and health. And the last, I think, piece of information that we probably want to emphasize that we're going to need for tracking both the two new indicators that were shown in the video earlier is to make systematic the production of the indicators on fiscal redistribution and how much is spent on the poor. Well, much more common than in the past, right now we do need a systematic support from international organizations and foundations to be able to track progress on fiscal redistribution. The World Bank has done a tremendous effort. We have done a tremendous effort, but at this point we are not ensured that this will be a systematic process unless the resources are devoted both within the international organizations and also supporting other initiatives like ours, so that we're able to continue producing this type of information and be able to track what happens to fiscal redistribution and spending on the poor.
Thank you. Very good points. In particular, a call for the UN agencies for more data. Good point, Nora. Mark?
Thanks so much. So the last major UN conference that was in person was the Statistical Commission in March of 2020. We remember it well. That was the last thing BC, before COVID. That was the commission which reviewed the indicators for the SDGs and approved a revised SDG 1.B.1. I love the nomenclature, which is public social spending accruing to the poor, nationally defined. But because of this unfortunate timing, there's been very little official reporting from national statistics offices, which were understandably, let's say, distracted. However, the World Bank, mainly looking at social transfers and social protection. UNICEF may be looking at education, but also some in social protection. And CEQ, addressing simultaneously all three sectors, have done some important work to fill these data gaps ad interim until the governments can take them under their own steam. So it is possible to report on the share of public social spending benefiting the poor in countries with more than half the world's population, although those countries include China, India and Indonesia, and in fact, so we have more than half the world's population with some 30 countries. So let's just keep our eyes on the population size. But we need these data, and this is just one indicator, and one indicator alone is not going to change the world. But it's a good start. Without good data, we're going to be flying blind. As Kofi Annan used to say, it's if you can't see it, you can't solve it. But we need to go beyond one data point. We need to look at intersectionality. So the focus of benefit incidence analysis so far is primarily in terms of income and wealth categories. But we need not only to be looking at evidence for other axes of inequity, but particularly looking at the combination, looking at wealth and age, or wealth and geographic location. And another area where we need more data would be, for policy purposes, is to look at the analysis by levels of service provision. So in some countries, primary school spending could be favouring the poorest groups, but tertiary level spending could be favouring the richest groups. And I'll return to this interesting idea a little bit later on. But we need equity analysis linked to efficiency of spending. We can't just say more needs to be spent. We need to be saying how, seeing and saying how equitable and how efficiently that spending is being used. And we have an example of looking at these issues in a UNICEF report, Fiscal Equity and Social Outcomes for Children. I had to put a little plug for a UNICEF publication, apologies for that. But also we need to be really careful about how we interpret these results. This is not necessarily an entirely intuitive indicator. For example, in some countries, primary school expenditures may seem to favour the poorest groups, but it's only because better off families avoid the public school system altogether and send their children to private schools, which they consider to be a better quality. And so what we could be seeing is the poor services for the poor syndrome, rather than spending which is actually benefiting the poor to the extent that it should be. So those are just a few ideas of where we've got to and where the big gaps are going forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. I want to follow up with a question on how fiscal equity and understanding decision taxes can be measured and what methodologies exist. And for that, I would like to give the word to Nora first and then Carolina.
Thank you, Enrique. All right, so what is it that we do in order to measure fiscal equity and how taxes and transfers, public spending in general, affect people's incomes? We use a methodology known as fiscal incidence analysis. And fiscal incidence analysis essentially is a method to allocate the burden of taxes and the benefits from government spending to households. And it allows them to calculate incomes before and after taxes and transfers. And then we can compare indicators that are calculated using before taxes and transfers with those indicators, the same indicators, after taxes and transfers. So, for example, we calculate the Gini coefficient for inequality or any other inequality measure for the pre-fisc incomes, and then we calculate them for the post-fisc incomes. And the post-fisc incomes can be defined in different ways, by the way, because we may want to include not just personal income taxes and cash transfers, but we also must emphasize including indirect taxes like value-added tax, excise taxes, because those are paid by people when they buy stuff, and it affects the level of consumption, and the same with subsidies. And also we may want to include the monetized value of spending on things like education and health. So when we have these different concepts of post-fisc income, we can calculate our indicators of inequality and poverty, whichever ones you like, and compare them with the same indicators with the pre-fisc incomes. And that's the way we do sort of the measurement of how fiscal equity is affected by decisions on taxes and transfers. This type of method has been around since the 1940s. It was primarily focused in advanced countries, but thanks to the work that we've been doing both at our institute and in collaboration with the World Bank, the IMF, OECD, UNICEF too, by the way, as you know, we've done the fiscal incidence analysis for children with you. Thanks to all of that, I think we're close to about 70 countries in the world, which is quite amazing, with methods that are quite comparable and that cover about 80% of the world's extreme poor in this type of analysis. So we've done quite a bit. But like I said earlier, we need support to continue this in the different organizations so that you can not only have a snapshot of what's happening now, but like I say, I call it the movie. How is this going to evolve? Is it moving in the right direction? Because that's what we're going to need in order to be able to track. And I think that to further equip data producers, there needs to be much more in-country training in fiscal incidence analysis, especially at the level of the ministries of finance. It may be, I think it would be desirable at some point to sort of mainstream this type of analysis and that it becomes part of the budget process on a regular basis. And some countries have tried to do that. And I think that is very helpful because then they know from the start how their decisions in terms of taxes and spending affects the outcomes in fiscal equity. It should also become part of the national accounts reporting, not just the aggregate values, but have the results done in a way that you can see what happens to pre-fisc incomes, the distribution of them, and post-fisc. And we know that this has been now pushed by the DNA project led by the OECD and also by what the with World at the Paris School of Economics is doing with their DINA project. So this could be mainstream, and then you would have the data produced on a regular basis and formally as part of the national account system. So I think these are, the important elements that you need to have, both in terms of type of methodology, the data, and the institutional setting, so you're going to be able to track what's happening to fiscal equity through decisions that affect fiscal policy.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Nora. Carolina, do you want to add a few words?
Yes, thank you. And, I think Nora has sort of described very nicely how the machinery works, generally speaking. And I want to emphasize a point that she made towards the end, that is the fact that we've all, in a way, coordinated, right, and sort of embraced the methodology that she originally developed, and we've sort of all worked together to continue to expand that, gives us this power, right, to use the results from different countries in a comparative manner. And I think that's really critical when it comes to mobilizing policymakers, and I know we're going to get into that a little bit later. So I'll just say a couple words on frontier issues that some of us or all of us, jointly are looking into, and maybe some frontier issues that we need to look into, as we move forward when we think about fiscal incidence analysis. So the first one that I think is critical, particularly because we've touched upon it earlier in the conversation, is that when we look at in-kind spending, right, when we look at health and education, we do make a series of sort of relatively basic assumptions currently, when we do fiscal incidence analysis, in terms of, who attends schools, and then we do a little bit of sort of per capita assignment of budgets, and we assume that that's the transfer, right, that these households are getting. But we all know that that's a very rough way of looking at it. So continuing to think about how we can incorporate notions of quality into this analysis, ultimately trying to get to the notion of what value do households really derive, right, from this spending, which of course is hard, but to the extent that we can proxy that, I think will be interesting. And I know some of us are thinking about that, but hopefully we'll get to something that is more generalizable later on. Nora talked a little bit about the work that has been done in looking at fiscal incidence analysis for children, right? And I think there's more that we can do to understand how fiscal policy affects specific groups. Children is one of them. We are doing some work, including with Nora's team, on looking at the gender impacts of fiscal policy, both directly but also through the incentives that they generate, that fiscal policy generates for labor force participation and other sort of intra-household decisions. So that's another area where I think, there's more that we can do. There's the perennial challenge of top incomes, which is critical when we think about, what fiscal policy does or doesn't, particularly on the sort of taxation side. But we know that there we are really handicapped by the kind of data that we get from household surveys. And this is something that we didn't sort of mention when we talked about data gaps, but that I want to highlight. Many times in this analysis, we are not just constrained by the fiscal data available to us, but we are constrained by the household data available to us. And I think on top incomes, that's a reality. We are increasingly trying to think about the distributional impacts of infrastructure spending. And we think this is important because, as I said earlier, things like investments in roads, investments in electricity and water and sanitation are critical for well-being. And, Kevin also talked about sort of this more multidimensional notion of poverty. But I don't think we have all the right tools to incorporate those kinds of expenditures into the fiscal incidence analysis and say something meaningful about who benefits and who doesn't. So I think that's another area where we could sort of push the envelope. And then finally, and this is more sort of a pie in the sky, I think at the moment, there's a lot of conversation now around green taxation, carbon taxes and other environmentally sort of oriented taxation. Those, like every other tax, will have distributional impacts. And, it's not entirely obvious what they would be, but I think it's something that at some point we'll have to sort of wrap our heads around. And then finally, and this is something that Nora has already worked on, but I think we need to sort of work together to generalize across the analysis that we do in countries. is across all these items. And when we look at the distributional impact of fiscal policy overall, really thinking about this idea of, the effectiveness of redistribution, right? So you have governments moving a lot of money around, right? They tax and they spend, and dollars sort of fly back and forth. And as Nora said, in some cases, the result of that is progressive. In some cases, it actually isn't, when you add it all up. But I think, in addition to sort of that net impact, understanding a little bit better how much redistribution is being achieved per dollar moved, if you want, right? Because, every time you move a dollar, there's a distortion that, can be associated with it. I think that's something that, it's worth thinking a little bit more about. And again, I know Nora has done some work on that, and we could probably all sort of take it on and be more systematic. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Carolina. I think you have given us enough material for several meetings like this in the next World Data Fora. Next question, and this will go for Kevin and Mark. If you can explain a bit further some of the points you made earlier about these new SDG indicators and the role of decision makers, citizens, and civil society organizations. Kevin?
Sure. Well, I think one of the most important aspects of all of this is the interface between data, knowledge, information that Carolina and Nora have set out brilliantly, and its political use. And these are actually two separate things, right? Let's be honest that, in many environments, what is constraining progressive policy, redistributive policy that is beneficial for the poor, is not a lack of information, it's political choice. And this goes, I think, to Nora's point, which has taken on an added urgency now, because as governments move towards consolidating their fiscal position, in some cases tightening monetary policy, the risks of perverse distribution outcomes is rising. And I'll give you one very immediate example of that. I'm sitting here in London. We have a government which, in the face of all of the information of its impacts, is about to remove about $9 billion from the poorest 20% of households in the country. And, we have an Institute for Fiscal Studies who has explained in copious detail what the consequences of that will be for household poverty. So this is not an information gap. This is a political decision, an overtly and explicitly anti-poor political decision. Look at the debate in the US on child tax credit, where you have a Republican Party and some Democrats actually taking positions in full awareness of the impact of the policy for the poor coming down on the wrong side of the line. So I think it's really, really critical, and it's why it's so great to see the World Bank working with NGO, what the World Bank and Nora, UNICEF, working with civil society on how we operationalize this data, how we understand the political economy of change. And in that context, the one thing to state the blindingly obvious, as a campaigning and a political platform, the advocacy for the 1.41 or whatever the numbers are, or the 4.32 option is not exactly going to get a lot of people out on the streets behind the cause. So I do think it's really, really imperative to find a narrative. I mean, the fiscal incidence narrative is a barrier to entry for a lot of people who have similar objectives to all of us here. So I think finding the right narrative, and beyond the narrative, the specific points that illustrate the policy. I gave before the example of we've now got hundreds of millions of children who are going back into school having lost a whole year of learning with no support, going back into classrooms where teachers who were already, school systems that were already failing them, are under greater pressure, where their budgets are being cut, children carrying all of the disadvantages of the poverty and the malnutrition they're experiencing at home. Now, is the way of responding to this, like, how do we prevent these children dropping out? And there are clearly well-defined interventions for adolescent girls, school meal programs, I don't know, but the more concrete and specific that we can make it, I would say, the better. And maybe just to end with the point, both Nora and Carolina have made the point about top income analysis. Although I know many years ago, Mike Walton actually did some very good work in the bank on estimates, not household survey-based estimates for top income. But we now do have these other tools, like the Pandora tool. I think this is such an important part of the story. And I think all of us are working with the Paris School and others in different contexts. But maybe next year when we have this discussion, we could bring those guys in to, I think, turn the spotlight on that part of the equation as well.
Thank you, Kevin. Definitely a very important part of the equation, the top income, and of course the illegal and immoral tax havens. Mark, do you want to add a few words?
Sure, and I want to go to one of those illegal and immoral tax havens and investigate further in person. I'm so happy to be here in person, so I'm a big fan now. So, I mean, it's actually been a theme running through the forum is that data are necessary but not sufficient, if we can use that terminology, for making policy change. And there are different things we can do to try and make them more actionable, I guess. And that's, as a data geek, that's my job, is to try and get data in the right place to be able to make a difference. So partly is what Nora was referring to is getting this into this system of national accounts. It's not the most exciting title, but once you have it in the official system, it's something that can't just be dismissed. It can be, there were examples from Kevin, but it's much harder to ignore it if it's part of your national system. So that's the first thing. The second is how you portray it, as Kevin was talking about the narrative. So if we start talking about the trying to improve the quantity of fiscal space that's allocated to the poor, that is a harder sell than selling quality, saying all of these tax dollars that you are all paying, they need to be used better, and we can see that there will be a bigger benefit from doing this in a different way. So it's not just saying, we need to tax you more to be able to make a difference in the lives of some people, but to say we can use better what is already there and we can make a bigger difference with the same money. And the other is that we really have to make it usable. So this SDG is fine as an indicator in many ways, but if you ask me whether 13% is good or bad, the answer is, well, it depends. And part of what it depends on, is 13% of the country income going to the public expenditure going to the poor. It depends on what percentage of the population is poor. So I think we need to take this indicator and put it together with other data to be able to make more of an impact on it. So, maybe it's just sort of putting the ratio of the percentage of public social spending which is benefiting the poor to the proportion of the population which is poor. And then you can say, well, that means you're using the same poverty line for both, which is also important. But also you can just see if the ratio is larger than one, the poor are benefiting more than proportionally to their share of the population. So it begins to have more teeth because it's easier to grasp because it's more comprehensive in that way. I'll leave it there. I think basically we just have to make it usable and have a good narrative.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. Let's try, if you allow me, we'll watch a video, which hopefully has some of the narratives, and it's a good collaboration with civil society because it's a video prepared by Save the Children.
Public revenue and public expenditure decisions have a huge impact on children. However, this impact is not felt generally. Children from poor households tend to bear a bigger brunt as compared to those from affluent households. It is in this regard that it is important to conduct commitment to equity assessments to help us understand the realities. This year, we conducted a child-focused commitment to equity assessment for the very first time and came up with a report titled Fair Shares, Fiscal Equity for Children in Kenya. Quite a number of findings were made. First, it was found that overall, social spending on children was largely pro-poor. In the area of education, for example, public investment in education, in pre-primary education, was found to be pro-poor, and this is largely because of the free primary education policy that was introduced in the year 2003. However, the same was not true for secondary education. In the area of healthcare, it was found that investment in primary healthcare was largely pro-poor. However, when it came to investment in health services in facilities, it was found that children from affluent households tend to benefit more compared to those from poor households. On social assistance, it was found that the programs were largely pro-poor. However, they are very limited in scope and size. And the only main program that we found was the Orphans and Vulnerable Children Cash Transfer Program that targets children who are largely orphans and vulnerable. In conclusion, we found that it is very important for the government to consider having child-focused commitment to equity assessments as a basis for their planning. And it is in this regard that we would want to engage both the national and the county governments during the next planning phase that will be done sometime next year to consider having child-focused commitments to equity assessments done as a basis for planning, so that when the county governments would be developing their county integrated development plans in September next year, we would want this to be a critical tool that would inform the decisions for the county governments in the next 5 years. And the same would apply to the national government when it's coming up with a medium-term framework from next year. We would want child-focused commitment to equity assessments to play a critical role in informing those decisions.
Very good, excellent. As we're all here again, as I said, I have one last round of questions for all of you. We also have questions in the chat, and we would like to have some of you respond to those because we were supposed to have a Q&A session. So I will start with the question, and maybe Oliver, you can read one or two of the questions which are there. In particular, there was one about civil society organizations. So there is a running theme in everything that you have been saying in terms of utilization and of the data and capacity to generate the data. And I would like to see if you can tell us a little bit more about that. And also some of you said that you had points that you wanted to come back to. So maybe there are one or two points that you had in mind that you haven't had a chance yet to address. So this is your chance in about 1 minute and 36 seconds each. Who wants to go first?
Well,
No, please. Yes, absolutely. Go ahead. And then Carolina.
I don't know if it's addressing the question. I was looking for it in the chat, but it's not there, so apologies. But there's one thing that I want to take the opportunity to emphasize that has been mentioned earlier, is the education issue. We have been doing work for Latin America. I don't know how familiar you are with the projections that we have made in terms of what the impact of what's happened with growing educational gaps can have in the future. According to our results for Latin America, for children that were born to parents in low socioeconomic families, they could face a likelihood to complete high school, which would be similar to children that were born in the 1960s. So we're moving back like 30 years. This is for children of the poorer households. Children of middle-class households, richer households, have faced almost no problem in replacing schooling by homeschooling. This gap, we call it, could be the lasting scar of COVID. And it could result in lower inequality of opportunity in the future. So we're really planting the seeds of more inequalities in the future if we don't do anything now. In fact, it could also result in higher wage inequality because at some point then, children with lower skills today will be people entering the workplace with lower skills. They become relatively abundant, and so the wage gap may be moving in the direction against people with lower skills again, as it happened in the 1990s and in the 1980s. So it is a very, very serious problem, and it requires major effort to contain. Part of that effort has to come from decisions that involve public finance, because spending on education certainly does not have to be cut. Now, when we're facing the reining of fiscal deficits, is one of the areas that has to be highly protected, not just health, education too. But it may require more resources because you will need to complement regular teaching with other initiatives that can actually remediate what's happened during the pandemic and school closures. Maybe those resources, I think, will not be able to be provided just by governments. It has to be a mobilization that involves civil society and the private sector in earnest. Otherwise, I think we'll be very sorry in years from now. I mean, it's bad now, but what's going to be out there in the horizon may be quite terrible if we're not able to contain the impact of what the school closures meant for the children of parents of low socioeconomic background.
Thank you, Nora. Very sobering, interesting, but sobering results on education that you mentioned. Carolina, you also raised your hand, and so did Kevin. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to build on what Kevin and Mark mentioned earlier in terms of how do we make sure that this data and this analysis actually has an impact on policy, which is ultimately what we're trying to get to, right? I mean, Nora, I think very eloquently just talked about that. And I was thinking about what are some of the lessons learned or maybe some of the cross-cutting sort of themes that we see in engagements where we have been successful, right, in sort of providing this analysis and getting policy traction at the country level. And I think there are a few things that, so maybe to put a little bit of a positive spin, on this, I think overall somewhat sobering conversation. So one thing that I think has been critical in those cases where we've seen success is that we've followed what we call sort of a corporate action model, right? So we've done a lot of the work from the very beginning with country counterparts. And this includes conversations early on in terms of what are the policy questions that they're interested in, what are the challenges that they're facing, what are the kinds of reforms that are being discussed, so that from the get-go, you're really targeting your analytical efforts and the data efforts to speak to those questions. And you also use those kind of as an entry point sometimes to expand that discussion, right? But you have to find the entry point. Making sure that they're following the process and they're broadly understanding what you're doing, right, in terms of the methodology and the analysis. They don't need to become experts, but they need to understand what's behind the results, right, for them to, I think, fully absorb those results. And then one thing that we found really powerful, and again, this is, I think, the beauty of this comparability in the methodology, is that benchmarking countries and sometimes putting a country's context in comparison with others, it's a very powerful message. And you can take yourself out of the picture, right? They can find themselves in the landscape and see, where they're doing well and where they aren't. And sometimes that actually provides kind of a bit of an additional kick for action. So those are some of the sort of elements while we are doing this. One thing that I think we've all sort of focused on is sustainability, right? So we're there, we can help, do this analysis once, twice, but ultimately what we, I think, are all aspiring to is that this becomes part of the policy making process, right? I mean, we were talking about national accounts, etc. So building capacity for this kind of analysis and sometimes sort of transferring the technology, right, to a minister of finance or something like that is useful, because otherwise it's hard for this to become part of their DNA, right, when they are having those fiscal discussions and so on. And then finally, and I think Nora and I think Kevin also alluded to this, taking the conversation beyond the government, right, engaging other actors in the country that are powerful actors in the policy sphere. And sometimes that's tricky because, you have to balance kind of your policy dialogue with, that broader engagement. But we should, I think, all strive for sort of providing that analytical foundation to an informed policy conversation, not just with the government, but in the country, right, among the critical actors. So again, I know these are all things that we are doing, but I wanted to put them out there because I think when those things happen, we do see success and we do see traction on the policy sphere. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolina. Kevin and then Mark, and we still have one more question and one more video. So go ahead.
Thanks, Enrique. Well, maybe just to build a little bit on Carolina's point, Enrique, first of all, which is that, I do think there's something incredibly powerful on focusing on what would broadly be understood as fair and just outcomes. And I think children, and I'm not saying this just because I used to work for Save the Children or because UNICEF are on the platform as well, but I think there are many issues which, if you approach them from, let's say a political, philosophical issue, can be very divisive. Whereas if you approach them from, what is the right and a fair outcome for a child in this, can really cut through polarization. And I give as an example of that, the idea of a child, because they're born in a certain place, to parents in a certain place in the wealth distribution, face twice the risk of not getting to their 5th birthday. I think most people would say, look, this is not acceptable, right? Now, we can argue about a lot of stuff, but this is not acceptable. The idea that, a girl has half the chance of getting into the second grade of secondary in a country like Nigeria to a boy. I mean, this is bad for the nation. It's unfair, and so on. So I would say the more that we can bring this back to basics and build a narrative around what are the outcomes, that would be broadly perceived as right and fair, the stronger our case can be. And in that context, I did want to just introduce this as a cautionary note. In an area like health, to use the graph that was shown a bit earlier, I can't remember the numbers, but the fact that the poorest 20% have a slightly higher share of spending of the health budget than 20% is not, to me, an intuitive example of equity. I mean, the poorest 20% in Kenya account for almost 40% of child mortality. So, if you were focusing on what is needed from public finance to drive a fairer outcome on child mortality, you'd have a different indicator. So I just wanted to put that on the table to really urge everyone to, focus on sort of the deeper understanding of equity in these areas. The last point I wanted to make, I think what Nora set out on education, I wish we had another hour, because, much of what is written about the scarring effects of COVID, like, if you read regional economic outlooks from the fund, they tend to focus on the output scarring effects, which are actually very modest, by the way, both globally and in many regions. They're far more modest than in the 2008 financial crisis, for example. But if you look at impacts on education, I mean, this is the single biggest reversal in education in history, right? Not only modern history, I mean, as in history, there has never been a reversal like this. And we know that most countries do not have in plans the mechanisms in education, the remedial mechanisms in education to facilitate catch up. You put together learning losses, mounting pressure on education systems, children coming back into education, carrying elevated levels of poverty and malnutrition. I mean, that is a prescription for wholesale reversal. And, there should be as much debate about the failure of the international response in that area as there is on vaccine equity. And unfortunately, there just isn't that level of debate. So, again, put it on the list for future discussion. But I think Nora really, this is not just about Latin. I think, Nora, you said the study was in Latin America. But I would say what Nora's described is a global phenomenon.
Yes, absolutely. Not just in Latin America. I think you're right, Kevin. And unfortunately, Carolina had to step out because we are at the time limit of our allocation. But maybe, Mark, you can say a last couple of words?
Very briefly. And being in person, I'm getting the visual cues of people coming in for the next session already. So let me just summarize it in three things. I think there are three key ingredients. The narrative that Kevin's pointing out is the fourth. It is running throughout. But we have to have ownership in the country. So the government needs not only to own the data, but to own the analysis and its results. Because then they will be much better place to start using the results of that analysis. Secondly, there needs to be capacity. Compared to other SDG indicators, there's a reasonable amount of data around, and the methodology is pretty clear, but a lot of the National Statistics Office or the National Statistics System more broadly doesn't necessarily have those techniques to hand, so we need to help that happen. But thirdly, there needs to be demand for this. This can't be just something that we're trying to foist on the world. The world needs to want to know this, if you see what I mean. And I particularly think of the parliaments or assemblies or congresses. They need to be asking for these data analysis when they're negotiating the national budget, when they're thinking about how the budget is done. So I think that's a sometimes overlooked area where there can be a great deal of progress made if they will own it and demand it.
Thank you, Mark, for those words. Yes, I'm sorry that people are going to try to push you out of the room. We actually have another video by one of our collaborators, the Global Development Network, and fantastic questions on the chat. What we're going to do is we're going to add all of those to the recording, so it's available. And the World Data Forum has a mechanism, a platform, to keep on answering those questions after the session is over. So I apologize that we didn't have time to read all the questions, but we're going to forward them to the speakers. Thank you, all four of you, although Karina's not here, but thank you, all four of you, for fantastic interventions and patience with my limited moderation skills. And I want also to thank Oliver and Samantha, who from Save the Children and CQ have been incredible partners in putting this together. We would not have been able to do it if it had not been for that those three legs. So thank you very much. And for those of you who still have a few hours ahead of you, enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Thank you. Bye.
Many thanks for inviting me to this panel. My name is Francesco Bino, and I'm Head of Programs at the Global Development Network, or GDN. GDN is an international public organization that focuses on promoting research capacities across the Global South. I'm glad I could join the discussion for a couple of reasons. First, the partnership behind this panel is extremely promising. By joining forces, I believe CQ, GDN, Save the Children, and UNICEF can make a real difference in the way development actors think about government policy and equity, particularly when we talk about evidence-informed debate. The second reason is that the structure of this panel, with the emphasis on 3 interlinked steps, measurement, reporting, and action, echoes very closely the work the Global Development Network has been doing on research capacity in the Global South. The way we define research systems in our Global Doing Research flagship initiative is as the combination of 3 functions: production, diffusion, and uptake. In this initiative, we study how applied social research takes place across these 3 functions in different countries. At the core of this framework is the belief that a performing research system is one where policy-relevant knowledge is not only generated, but also discussed and used. In other words, and to echo the title of this event, data becomes evidence and knowledge only if it is debated, challenged, validated, and selectively used. Data is also part of the socially mediated process of learning and making choices. This brings me to the importance of local capacity. Unless there is capacity locally to carry out all 3 functions, calling a piece of information policy-relevant evidence is simply redundant, or an exercise in labeling. This is why the all research at GDN funds, in partnership with research donors, is led by local principal investigators. Our partnership with other organizations on this panel aims to move forward in this direction with specific attention to fiscal equity. In partnership with even more institutions, we want to build in parallel capacities, evidence, and debates to support impactful development policies locally, while making sure local experiences are connected across locations and countries in a global feedback loop that we can all learn from. Many thanks.